Dante Gray fixed what no one else could. The quiet mechanic in Chicago, Illinois, had become a ghost in his own story, watching engineers fail where his hands would have succeeded. For 43 years, he chose silence over spectacle, invisibility over confrontation. When the manufacturing plant's heart stopped beating, he worked through the darkness, resurrecting machinery others had declared terminal. Hours later, the board discovered his original patent. The technology that saved them was his invention all along. Now, recognition arrives like a storm after drought, and Dante must ask himself, was humility ever worth the price of being forgotten? The factory floor stretched before Dante Gray like a cathedral of rust and ambition, its ceiling disappearing into shadows that even the industrial lights couldn't penetrate. At 43, his hands carried the topography of labor, calluses that told stories his mouth refused to speak, scars that mapped decades of machinery more temperamental than the men who owned them. He stood before the massive production line, silent and still, while engineers in pressed shirts argued in clusters around the broken mechanism that had paralyzed the entire Chicago plant. Their voices echoed off steel beams and concrete floors, creating a symphony of expensive desperation. Dante listened with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that speaking rarely changed anything, that his words carried less weight than the grease beneath his fingernails. The machine before them wasn't just broken, it was suffering in ways only someone who understood its language could recognize. The malfunction had persisted for 4 months now, transforming the multi-million manufacturing plant into a monument to failure. Each week brought new consultants with leather briefcases and confident diagnoses, men who spoke in technical jargon that sounded impressive in boardrooms but dissolved into confusion on the factory floor. They would circle the machine like vultures, studying roadkill, tapping tablets and making notes that never translated into solutions. Dante watched them come and go with the changing seasons, each departure leaving behind another layer of frustration that settled over the plant like industrial dust. The workers had begun to joke darkly about the machine being cursed, about it being smarter than the people trying to fix it. But Dante didn't laugh at these jokes because he knew the truth. The machine wasn't cursed. It was simply misunderstood by people who had never bothered to listen to what it was trying to say. He had been working at the plant for 17 years, arriving each morning before dawn, when the building still held the cold silence of abandonment. His routine never varied: punch in at the rusted time clock, change into coveralls that had become softer with each washing, and begin his rounds through the labyrinth of machinery that most workers avoided. Management knew him as reliable but unremarkable, the kind of employee who never complained, never asked for raises, never made waves that might disturb the careful hierarchy of corporate structure. They didn't know about the nights he spent in his garage workshop, but the notebooks filled with designs and calculations that he'd been keeping since his 20s. They didn't know that when he looked at the broken machine, he saw not just a malfunction, but a creature in pain, something that needed understanding rather than aggressive intervention. His silence had become so habitual that people forgot he had a voice at all. The lead engineer, a man named Richardson, with silver hair and expensive glasses that caught the fluorescent light, was gesturing dramatically at the exposed mechanics of the disabled line. His frustration had evolved over the months from professional concern to something bordering on personal offense, as if the machine's refusal to cooperate was a direct insult to his credentials. Dante had heard the rumors circulating through the break room that Richardson's firm had guaranteed a solution within 6 weeks, that his reputation was now tied to this mechanical corpse that refused resurrection. The other engineers clustered around him wore variations of the same defeated expression, their initial confidence eroded by weeks of failed attempts and mounting pressure from the board. They spoke about replacing the entire system, about cutting losses and starting fresh with updated technology. But Dante knew that replacing it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. These people didn't understand what they were dealing with because they had never taken the time to truly see it. Night began to settle over the plant as the day shift filtered out through heavy doors that clanged shut with finality. Dante remained behind, as he often did, long after the consultants had packed their expensive tools and retreated to hotel rooms where they could pretend their failure was temporary. The silence that filled the building after everyone left was different from the daytime cacophony. It was heavy with possibility, thick with the breathing of dormant machinery waiting for someone to understand its language. He approached the broken line slowly, running his fingers along its metal surfaces with the tenderness of someone greeting an old friend. The coolness of the steel beneath his palm sent familiar signals through his nervous system, awakening knowledge that lived deeper than conscious thought. He didn't need diagrams or computer models. His body remembered the truth that his mind had been forced to forget, remembered the days when this technology had been nothing more than sketches in a notebook he carried everywhere, when these designs had been his children before they were stolen and renamed by others. The overhead lights hummed their electric lullaby as Dante finally allowed himself to acknowledge what he had been avoiding for 17 years. This machine, this temperamental beast that had defeated an army of credentialed experts, was built on the skeleton of his original designs, patents he had filed decades ago when he was young enough to believe that brilliance alone could protect you from being erased. He had signed them away in a moment of desperate need, trading his intellectual children for rent money and the promise of employment, never imagining that those designs would become the foundation of an empire that would never speak his name. The plant had been built on his innovations, grown wealthy on his genius, while he had been relegated to the shadows as a simple mechanic whose presence was barely acknowledged. Standing there in the gathering darkness, Dante felt the weight of every swallowed word. Every moment he had chosen silence over self-advocacy. Every time he had watched others receive credit for work that had originated in his imagination. The machine before him wasn't just broken. It was a mirror reflecting his own fractured dignity back at him, asking whether he had the courage to finally speak the truth he had been hiding for so long. Dante Gray worked through the night with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to make peace with solitude. His toolbox lay open beside him like a trusted companion, each implement worn smooth from decades of use, bearing the patina of countless repairs that had never made it into official records. The plant around him had transformed in the darkness, shedding its daytime personality of industrial aggression to reveal something more vulnerable, machinery that breathed and whispered in the absence of human observation. He moved through the shadows with practiced grace, his footsteps echoing softly on concrete floors that still held the warmth of the departed day. The broken production line loomed before him like a patient finally allowing its true symptoms to be examined, its metal surfaces catching occasional glints from the security lights that painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. This was the work he understood best. Not the performance of repair done under watchful eyes and ticking clocks, but the intimate conversation between a craftsman and the machinery that had been built from his dreams. His hands moved with certainty born from memory rather than current knowledge, following pathways through the machine's interior that he had designed 20 years ago when the world still felt conquerable. Each component whispered its purpose to him as he traced connections and examined joints, his fingers reading the story of how his original vision had been modified and corrupted by people who had never understood the elegance of his initial concept. The engineers who had failed here for months had been treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. They saw broken parts where Dante recognized a fundamental misunderstanding of the system's intended harmony. His modifications over the years as a humble mechanic had been subtle, small adjustments that kept the plant running without revealing that he was essentially maintaining his own creation in secret. But this malfunction was different. It required him to confront the core design, to acknowledge publicly what he had been hiding privately, to touch the heart of the machine that bore his intellectual fingerprints. The silence of the empty plant provided a cocoon within which Dante could finally be honest with himself about the cost of his chosen invisibility. He had convinced himself for so many years that peace was more valuable than recognition, that quiet competence was its own reward, that he could find satisfaction in knowing the truth even if no one else did. But as he worked through the complex repair, his body moving through movements that felt like muscle memory from another lifetime, he began to understand that his silence had been less about humility and more about fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of being dismissed again, fear of having to defend his worth to people who had already decided he was worthless. The machine beneath his hands represented more than broken equipment. It was the physical manifestation of everything he had given away, every compromise he had made, every time he had chosen to diminish himself to make others comfortable. His tools scraped and adjusted with soft metallic sounds that punctuated his thoughts, creating a rhythm that felt both meditative and accusatory. Hours passed unmarked, except by the gradual transformation happening within the machine's intricate systems. Dante worked with the intensity of someone performing surgery on their own past, carefully undoing modifications that had corrupted his original vision and restoring connections that had been severed by people who thought they knew better. The complexity that had defeated the consulting engineers was, to him, as familiar as his own heartbeat. These weren't random components assembled by committee, but rather an integrated system designed with a specific philosophy about how energy and motion should flow. He remembered drawing the initial schematics in a cramped apartment where the heat barely worked, remembered the excitement of seeing patterns that others had missed, remembered believing that his innovations would change his life in ways that felt impossibly distant now. The patent office had accepted his applications with bureaucratic indifference, processing his brilliance as if it were no different from a trademark application for a restaurant chain. He had been so naive then, believing that legal ownership of an idea was the same as social recognition of its value. The eastern windows began to show the first hints of dawn as Dante made the final adjustments, his fingers moving with the gentle precision of someone closing a wound that had been open too long. The machine before him had been transformed not through replacement or aggressive intervention, but through understanding, through recognizing what it was meant to be and removing the obstacles that prevented it from achieving that purpose. He could feel the change in the system as components that had been fighting each other for months suddenly found their intended rhythm, could sense the restoration of harmony that the original design had promised. His back ached from hours of awkward positioning, his knees protested from kneeling on unforgiving concrete, but these physical complaints felt distant compared to the emotional weight that seemed to be shifting inside his chest. Something had changed during these nighttime hours. Some internal barrier had weakened. Some long-held resolve to remain invisible had begun to crack under the pressure of finally touching his own creation, without pretense or disguise. As the first workers began to arrive for the morning shift, Dante stepped back from the now functioning production line and experienced a moment of vertigo that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The machine hummed with restored life, its movement smooth and precise, operating exactly as he had envisioned it 2 decades earlier when his dreams still felt achievable. But the satisfaction he expected to feel was complicated by something darker, a growing awareness that this repair had not been an anonymous good deed, but rather a declaration that could no longer be taken back. The evidence of his capability was now visible to anyone who cared to look, and he knew with absolute certainty that people would look, would ask questions, would begin to notice inconsistencies between his official role and his demonstrated expertise. He gathered his tools with hands that trembled slightly, suddenly aware that he had crossed a threshold from which there would be no quiet retreat. The machine was fixed, yes, but in fixing it he had broken something else, the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected him from confrontation for 17 years. The sunrise coming through the high windows felt less like the promise of a new day and more like exposure, like being forced into light when you had grown comfortable in darkness. Duh. The board meeting convened at 10 in the morning in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the factory floor, a deliberate architectural choice meant to remind executives that their decisions had tangible consequences below. 6 men and 2 women sat around a polished table that reflected their faces back at them with uncomfortable clarity, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. The production line was operational again after 4 months of expensive failure, and none of them could quite understand how the miracle had occurred. Richardson, the lead consulting engineer, sat at one end of the table with his reputation intact, but his confidence visibly shaken, unable to explain how a malfunction that had defeated his entire team had been resolved overnight. The plant manager, a pragmatic woman named Gloria Santos, who had built her career on understanding industrial operations, kept glancing down at the floor where Dante was visible through the glass, going about his usual rounds as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The board wanted answers, wanted to understand the mechanism of their salvation, wanted to identify who deserved credit for pulling them back from the edge of catastrophic production losses. The initial investigation began with routine questions: who had access to the plant overnight, what contractors had been scheduled, whether Richardson's team had made a final attempt that somehow succeeded after they left. But each inquiry led to dead ends that pointed increasingly toward an impossibility that made the executives uncomfortable, that their miracle had been performed not by expensive consultants, but by a mechanic whose name most of them couldn't remember. Gloria Santos had pulled the security footage and watched it 3 times before the meeting, observing Dante's solitary work through the night with an expression that shifted from skepticism to growing astonishment. She saw not the fumbling attempts of someone trying random solutions, but rather the confident movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who approached the machine not as a puzzle to be solved, but as something familiar that simply needed to be reminded of its proper function. The footage showed him working without reference materials, without consulting manuals or diagrams, his hands moving through the repair with the fluidity of muscle memory rather than studied technique. Richardson had been asked to review the actual repairs that had been made, to analyze the mechanical changes that had restored functionality where his sophisticated approaches had failed. He returned to the boardroom after an hour with a file folder that he set on the table, as if it contained evidence of something criminal rather than mechanical. His report detailed modifications that were, in his words, elegant to the point of seeming obvious in retrospect, adjustments that addressed not just the immediate malfunction, but underlying inefficiencies that had plagued the system since its installation. But what troubled him most, what had brought a strange tension to his professionally composed face, was the philosophical consistency of the repairs. They suggested an understanding of the machine's core purpose that went beyond troubleshooting into something closer to original design intent. The fixes weren't just technically correct. They revealed a vision of how the entire system was meant to function, a vision that Richardson himself had never fully grasped despite months of studying the equipment. Whoever had made these repairs didn't just understand the machine, they understood it in a way that suggested intimate familiarity with its conception. The board's attention finally focused where Gloria Santos had known it would eventually land, on Dante Gray. The quiet mechanic whose 17-year tenure at the plant had been so unremarkable that his personnel file was barely 2 pages long. One of the board members, a lawyer named Morrison who specialized in intellectual property, had begun asking questions that seemed tangential to the immediate situation. Questions about the plant's founding technology, about the patents that had been acquired during the facility's establishment in the early 2000s. His curiosity had been piqued by Richardson's description of the repairs reflecting original design intent, which raised the question of who that original designer had been and whether they were somehow still connected to the operation. Gloria Santos watched Morrison's face change as he scrolled through digital patent records on his tablet, watched his expression shift from casual interest to sharp attention. The conference room fell into a peculiar silence as Morrison continued reading, his fingers moving across the screen with increasing urgency, his breathing becoming audibly heavier in the acoustically perfect space. Morrison finally looked up from his tablet and asked a question that shattered the remaining assumptions in the room. Did anyone know that Dante Gray had filed 17 patents between 2000 and 2005? Covering the core technologies that the entire plant had been built upon? The silence that followed was not empty, but rather dense, with implications that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to speak aloud. Gloria Santos felt her understanding of the plant's history beginning to reorganize itself around this new information, felt the narrative she had been operating under for years revealing itself as incomplete. Richardson's face had gone pale as he processed what this meant about his months of failure. He'd been trying to fix machinery without understanding that the man who could have explained it to him had been present the entire time, watching silently while expensive consultants fumbled through problems he could have solved in hours. The board members exchanged glances that communicated varying degrees of alarm and calculation, each person beginning to assess the legal and public relations implications of having employed the original designer as a minimum wage mechanic for nearly 2 decades. The glass walls of the conference room suddenly felt less like transparency and more like a barrier that had kept them from seeing what was directly in front of them. Below on the factory floor, visible to anyone who cared to look, Dante Gray continued his rounds with the same steady rhythm he maintained every day, unaware that his decades of carefully preserved anonymity were dissolving in the executive suite above him. Morrison began pulling up the patent transfer documents, tracing the path by which Dante's intellectual property had been acquired by the corporation's predecessor company for what the lawyer described, with barely concealed disgust, as insulting compensation. The patents had been purchased during a period when Dante was presumably desperate enough to accept whatever was offered, and then leveraged into the foundation of an industrial operation worth hundreds of millions. Gloria Santos found herself looking down at Dante with entirely new eyes, seeing not the invisible worker she had taken for granted, but rather the architect of everything around them. The ghost haunting his own creation. The board's relief at having their production crisis resolved was now complicated by the uncomfortable realization that they owed their salvation to a man they had systematically failed to see, value, or compensate appropriately for 17 years. Dante Gray felt the shift in atmosphere before anyone spoke to him directly, noticed the way conversations would pause when he entered the break room, saw the glances that followed him across the factory floor with new weight behind them. 3 days had passed since his overnight repair, and the plant had returned to full production capacity, generating revenue that would appear on quarterly reports as evidence of management's effective crisis resolution. But something had changed in the invisible social architecture that governed workplace interactions. People were looking at him differently, speaking to him with a careful politeness that felt more like fear than respect. The security footage had been reviewed, the repairs had been analyzed, and somewhere in the executive offices above, conversations were happening that would inevitably reshape his carefully maintained obscurity. He continued his rounds with habitual precision, but his hands trembled slightly as they performed familiar tasks, his body registering the approaching confrontation, even as his mind tried to maintain its long-practiced denial. Gloria Santos found him on Thursday afternoon in the maintenance bay, surrounded by tools and the comfortable disorder of ongoing work. She approached with the careful neutrality of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation but knows that preparation rarely survives contact with reality. Her request was simple. Could he come to her office? There were some questions about the recent repair that needed clarification. Dante nodded without speaking, set down the wrench he had been holding, and followed her through corridors that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite 17 years of daily navigation. The walls seemed closer than usual, the fluorescent lights harsher, the ambient noise of machinery taking on an accusatory quality. His reflection appeared in passing windows and polished surfaces, showing him a man who looked older than 43, someone whose face carried the topography of accumulated compromises. He realized he had been preparing for this moment for 2 decades, rehearsing various versions of this conversation in his mind during sleepless nights. But now that it was actually happening, all his imagined speeches dissolved into wordless anxiety. Gloria's office was small, but meticulously organized, with a window that overlooked the production floor and walls decorated with operational certificates and safety awards. She gestured for Dante to sit in the chair across from her desk, then took her own seat, with the posture of someone trying to project both authority and sympathy simultaneously. The manila folder she placed on the desk between them contained printouts of patent documents, transfer agreements, and technical specifications that Dante recognized even from upside down. She began speaking in a tone that was professionally gentle, but carried undertones of something harder, confusion mixed with what might have been anger on his behalf. She explained that the board had discovered his connection to the plant's foundational technology, that they were trying to understand why he had never mentioned this during 17 years of employment, why he had allowed himself to be categorized and compensated as a basic mechanic when he was demonstrably capable of engineering work that had stumped credentialed experts. Her questions weren't accusations exactly, but they carried the weight of institutional bewilderment at behavior that didn't conform to expected patterns of self-advocacy. Dante listened to her questions with the expression of someone hearing charges read in a language they understand, but wish they didn't. How could he explain decisions that made sense only within the internal logic of survival? Choices that seemed inevitable at the time, but appeared cowardly in retrospect. He had been 26 when he filed those patents, full of the dangerous optimism that comes from not yet understanding how little the world cares about individual brilliance. The designs had come to him easily, flowing from some deep place where mathematics and intuition merged into solutions that felt more discovered than invented. But converting those innovations into material security had proven impossible for someone without connections or capital or the social polish that makes people take you seriously. The company that had purchased his patents had offered him employment as part of the deal, a position they described as ensuring he could continue contributing to the technology's development. He had believed them initially, had imagined himself as part of a team bringing his visions to life. The reality had been slower and more painful. Gradual marginalization, subtle suggestions that he wasn't quite fitting into the culture, reassignments to positions of decreasing responsibility until he ended up where he was now, maintaining machinery built from his own designs while receiving none of the recognition or compensation that should have accompanied his contributions. Gloria Santos listened to his halting explanation with an expression that cycled through surprise, sympathy, and something that might have been shame on behalf of the institution she represented. She asked the question that Dante had been dreading. Why had he never fought back, never demanded recognition, never pushed for what he deserved? The answer stuck in his throat because it required admitting truths about himself that he had spent decades avoiding. He had been afraid, yes, but fear had only been part of it. There had also been exhaustion, with the constant struggle to make people see his worth, weariness with having to prove himself again and again to people who had already decided he wasn't worth their attention. Silence had felt like dignity at first, a refusal to beg for acknowledgement that should have been freely given. But silence had calcified over the years into something less noble, a habit of self-erasure that had become easier than the alternative, a comfortable prison that he had built around himself one small compromise at a time. He had convinced himself that his internal knowledge of the truth was enough, that he didn't need external validation to know his own worth. But sitting in Gloria's office, forced to articulate the path that had led him here, Dante finally understood that his silence had never been about humility. It had been about hiding from the pain of being invisible, about choosing the certainty of obscurity over the risk of being seen and still dismissed. The conversation ended without clear resolution, Gloria promising that the board would need to discuss next steps, while Dante nodded with the numb compliance of someone who had surrendered control of their narrative years ago. Walking back through the plant toward his locker, he felt the full weight of recognition beginning to settle on his shoulders, not the triumphant vindication he might have imagined in younger years, but rather something heavier and more complicated. People were seeing him now, really seeing him, and the attention felt less like liberation and more like exposure. His co-workers whispered as he passed, their curiosity mixing with the resentment that often accompanies the revelation that someone you thought you knew has been hiding something significant. The machine he had repaired continued its smooth operation, indifferent to the human complications its resurrection had triggered. Dante realized with sudden clarity that the cost of his silence had been higher than he had ever admitted, not just in terms of money or recognition, but in the fundamental relationship he had with his own dignity. He had spent 17 years telling himself that peace was worth the price of invisibility. But standing there in the center of the factory floor, with dozens of eyes finally noticing him, he understood that he had never really been at peace. He had simply been hiding from the war. The weekend provided no refuge from the questions that circled in Dante's mind, like birds of prey, waiting for something to die. His small apartment in Chicago felt simultaneously too large and too confining, rooms that had served as adequate shelter for years suddenly revealing themselves as the physical manifestation of a life kept deliberately small. He sat at his kitchen table with coffee growing cold in a chipped mug, staring at the notebooks he had retrieved from the closet where they had been buried beneath boxes of accumulated years. The pages contained sketches and calculations from his 20s, evidence of a mind that had once believed in its own possibilities, drawings of machinery that had seemed revolutionary when he created them, and now existed as mass-produced industrial equipment, generating profits for people who had never spoken his name. His handwriting from that earlier era looked different, more confident, more expansive, the writing of someone who hadn't yet learned to make himself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want him. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability, pulling Dante back to the plant where his status had transformed from invisible to uncomfortably visible over the course of a single week. He was met at the entrance by Gloria Santos, who informed him with practiced professional courtesy that the board had requested a meeting to discuss his employment status and compensation. The phrase itself was neutral. But Dante heard the undertones. They were trying to determine how much trouble he represented, how much he might demand, how to manage the public relations disaster of having systematically undervalued and undercompensated the actual genius behind their industrial success. He followed Gloria through corridors he knew by heart. But today, they led not to his usual workstation, but rather to the executive suite, where decisions were made about people like him by people who had never experienced what it meant to be like him. The elevator ride up felt like ascending toward judgment. The numbers above the door, marking off floors that corresponded to increasing social distance from the factory floor where he belonged. The boardroom where they gathered was the same glass-walled space where his fate had been discussed days earlier, but now he sat at the actual table instead of being observed from above. The executives arranged around him wore expressions of calculated welcome, faces that had been trained to project concern, while revealing nothing of the strategic calculations happening behind carefully maintained eye contact. Morrison, the intellectual property lawyer, took the lead in what was clearly a choreographed presentation designed to manage Dante's expectations while appearing generous. He spoke about the board's appreciation for Dante's contributions, about their surprise and admiration at discovering his connection to the foundational technology, about their desire to ensure he received appropriate recognition going forward. The words sounded rehearsed because they were, each phrase carefully selected to acknowledge his value without admitting to decades of exploitation. Dante listened with the detached attention of someone watching a performance they know is insincere, hearing the spaces between words where the real message lived. They were afraid of him, afraid of what he might demand, afraid of the legal and reputational exposure his story represented. Morrison slid a document across the polished table surface, explaining with practiced smoothness that the board had authorized a compensation package reflecting Dante's actual expertise and contributions. The numbers on the page were larger than anything Dante had imagined receiving, a salary that would lift him from subsistence to something approaching comfort, accompanied by a title change that redesignated him as Chief Technical Consultant with authority over all maintenance operations. But beneath these apparent concessions lived clauses and stipulations that Morrison glossed over with the verbal sleight of hand that lawyers master: non-disclosure agreements, acknowledgements that all past patents were legitimately acquired, releases from any claims related to previous compensation, requirements that he not speak to media or employees about his history with the company. The offer was designed to look like recognition while actually functioning as silence, buying his continued complicity in the narrative that his invisibility had been somehow voluntary or mutually beneficial rather than a systematic failure of institutional justice. Dante stared at the document without speaking, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against his chest like physical mass. Part of him wanted desperately to sign, to accept this imperfect acknowledgement and move forward with at least some dignity restored. The money would change his life materially, would provide security he had never known, would allow him to stop worrying about rent and repairs and the constant low-grade anxiety of living one emergency away from catastrophe. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger since the night he repaired the machine, recognized this offer for what it truly was: hush money, a transaction designed to preserve the company's preferred narrative while buying his cooperation in the continued erasure of his actual story. The executives around the table watched him with the alert tension of people who have made what they consider a generous offer and cannot quite understand why it isn't being immediately accepted. They saw him as they had always seen him, as someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps fell from their table, someone whose silence could be purchased because his silence had already proven so cheap, Gloria Santos, sitting to his left, seemed to sense the conflict playing out behind his carefully neutral expression. She leaned forward slightly and spoke in a tone that carried genuine rather than performative concern, asking if he needed time to review the offer with a lawyer, if there were questions or clarifications he wanted to discuss. Her kindness was real, Dante could sense that, but it also inadvertently highlighted the fundamental problem. Even the most sympathetic people in this room still approached him as a problem to be solved, rather than a person whose decades of experience and hidden suffering might have something valuable to say about how institutions treat the people who make them possible. The offer sitting in front of him represented not just a financial transaction, but a choice about how he would allow his story to be remembered. As a neat resolution where everyone wins and no one has to confront uncomfortable truths, or as something messier and more honest, a testament to the cost of invisibility and the complicated price of finally being seen. Dante Gray looked around the boardroom at the faces waiting for his response and felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement after decades of pressure. He had spent 17 years telling himself that peace was worth any price, that being overlooked was preferable to being in conflict, that his internal knowledge of his own worth was sufficient compensation for external denial. But sitting there in the presence of people who wanted to transform his erasure into a mutually beneficial arrangement, he finally understood that true peace had never been available to him through silence. Only a kind of suspended suffering, a wound that never healed because it was never acknowledged. The document in front of him promised comfort, but demanded continued complicity in his own diminishment. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Dante found himself wondering whether comfort was actually what he wanted, or whether something else, something harder and more dangerous, might be worth pursuing even if it meant giving up the safety of invisibility forever. Dante Gray did not sign the document that day. Instead, he asked for time to consider the offer, watching the board members' expressions shift from confident expectation to poorly concealed frustration. Morrison, the intellectual property lawyer, had begun to speak about the deadline attached to the proposal when Gloria Santos intervened with surprising firmness, stating that a decision of this magnitude deserved adequate consideration and that the board could certainly extend appropriate professional courtesy. The meeting adjourned with an atmosphere of strained civility, everyone performing politeness while calculating their next moves. Dante returned to the factory floor, feeling simultaneously liberated and terrified, aware that refusing immediate acceptance had probably been interpreted as the opening move in a negotiation when it had actually been something simpler. A man finally saying no to people who had spent decades assuming he would always say yes. The week that followed existed in a strange liminal space where Dante's status within the plant became increasingly undefined. He continued performing his usual maintenance rounds, but now workers approached him with questions that went beyond basic troubleshooting, seeking his input on efficiency problems and design limitations they had previously suffered in silence. Word had spread through the unofficial networks that govern workplace knowledge. The mechanic, who everyone ignored, was actually the architect of the systems they all depended on, and his years of quiet competence were being retrospectively reinterpreted as hidden expertise rather than modest adequacy. Some co-workers treated this revelation with enthusiasm, excited to finally have access to someone who truly understood the machinery. Others responded with resentment that had been building for years without knowing its proper target, angry that he had allowed them to struggle with problems he could have easily solved. Dante fielded both reactions with the same quiet acceptance, understanding that he had helped create this situation through his own choices, even if those choices had been made under circumstances most people couldn't fully comprehend. Gloria Santos became an unexpected ally during this period of uncertainty. Perhaps because she recognized in Dante's situation a systemic failure that implicated her own management, even if she hadn't been present for the initial exploitation. She began quietly connecting him with an employment lawyer who specialized in intellectual property disputes, someone who could review the board's offer and help Dante understand the full scope of what he was being asked to relinquish. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who worked out of a small office in downtown Chicago, spent 3 hours reviewing Dante's patents, the transfer agreements from 2 decades ago, and the proposed settlement with increasingly visible anger. She explained to Dante in precise legal terms what he had already understood emotionally, that the original patent purchases had been conducted during a period when he had no bargaining power, that the compensation had been deliberately inadequate, that the company had built an empire on his innovations while keeping him in a position where he couldn't effectively advocate for himself. But she also explained the difficult reality. Proving exploitation in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain, requiring him to relive his erasure publicly while facing lawyers whose entire purpose would be to discredit his story and his character. The choice Patricia Chen laid out was brutally simple. Accept the board's offer and receive immediate material security in exchange for permanent silence, or reject it and pursue a legal challenge that might vindicate him publicly, but would certainly cost him years of peace and potentially leave him with nothing if the case failed. She didn't offer a recommendation because, as she explained, the decision wasn't purely legal but deeply personal, touching questions about what Dante needed for his own healing and what price he was willing to pay for different versions of justice. Dante left her office feeling more confused than when he had entered, the clarity he had experienced in the boardroom dissolving into the ambiguity of real-world consequences. Walking through Chicago streets filled with people rushing toward their own destinations, he felt the weight of his invisibility in a new way, not as something imposed externally, but as something he had collaborated in creating, a protective shell that had become a prison he couldn't quite bring himself to leave, despite now holding the key. The decision point arrived 2 weeks after the initial board meeting, when Morrison called to inform him that the offer would expire at the end of the business day. The lawyer's tone carried the confident authority of someone who believed the outcome was predetermined, that Dante would ultimately accept reality and sign the documents that would allow everyone to move forward without uncomfortable complications. Gloria Santos found Dante in the maintenance bay an hour before the deadline, sitting on a workbench surrounded by tools he had used for 17 years to maintain machinery he had designed 20 years ago. She didn't ask what he had decided, but simply stood there in companionable silence, her presence offering the gift of witness without judgment. Dante found himself telling her things he had never articulated to anyone, about the young man he had been who believed brilliance would be its own protection, about the slow process of learning that the world had no interest in protecting people like him, about the years of convincing himself that his silence was strategic when it had really been surrender. Gloria listened without interrupting, and when he finally fell silent, she asked a question that cut through all his strategic calculations. What did he actually want? Not what was practical or possible, but what did his heart want when he allowed himself to imagine justice? The answer came from a place deeper than rational thought, bypassing all his careful, self-protective mechanisms. He wanted his story told accurately, wanted the record to show what had actually happened, wanted young people who would come after him to understand that brilliance alone wasn't enough, and that sometimes the price of peace was too high even when you couldn't afford anything else. He wanted the engineers who had failed to fix his machine to know they had been defeated not by complexity, but by arrogance. Wanted the board to confront the fact that their empire was built on stolen genius. Wanted future Dante Greys to have the courage to speak when he had chosen silence. The material security the board was offering suddenly seemed less important than the intangible legacy of honesty, less valuable than refusing to participate one more time in the narrative that his erasure had been acceptable or justified. Gloria Santos nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected, and told him that whatever he decided, she would support him, even if it cost her professional comfort. Dante Gray walked into the boardroom at 4:30 that afternoon and did something he had trained himself never to do for 17 years. He spoke his truth without softening it to make others comfortable. He told the assembled executives that their offer was rejected, that their framing of his history as a series of mutual misunderstandings was a lie, that he would not sign documents pretending his exploitation had been consensual. He explained that he was not pursuing this out of vengeance, but out of a need to finally stop hiding from his own story, to acknowledge in the light what had been happening in shadow for 2 decades. Morrison began to speak about legal realities and practical considerations, but Dante continued talking over him with a firmness he hadn't known he possessed. He told them he understood the risks of fighting, understood he might lose everything, but that losing while telling the truth felt more like winning than succeeding while participating in a lie. The board members sat in stunned silence, unprepared for resistance from someone they had categorized as permanently defeated. And in that moment of confrontation, Dante finally felt something he had been missing for longer than he could remember. Not peace exactly, but rather the possibility of peace. The sense that he might eventually be able to look at himself without the shame that had been his constant companion since the day he signed away his patents for rent money and empty promises. The lawsuit that Dante filed 3 weeks later became a minor sensation in industrial circles, attracting attention from trade publications and labor advocates who saw in his story a crystallization of broader patterns of exploitation. Patricia Chen built the case around contract law and intellectual property precedents, arguing that the original patent purchases had been conducted under duress, when Dante lacked meaningful bargaining power, and that the subsequent decades of deliberate underemployment constituted a form of continuing harm. The company's lawyers responded with the aggressive efficiency of people defending a system that had always worked in their favor, attacking not just Dante's legal claims, but his character, suggesting his years of silence proved he had been satisfied with the arrangement, and that his current complaints represented opportunistic revisionism. The local media picked up the story as human interest rather than serious journalism. Brilliant inventor works as humble mechanic, unrecognized genius, toiling in obscurity, narratives that felt emotionally satisfying but somehow missed the deeper truth about institutional structures that make such erasure possible in the first place. Dante discovered that visibility, the thing he had unconsciously craved for decades while simultaneously avoiding it, was far more complicated than he had imagined. Journalists wanted simplified narratives with clear heroes and villains, inspirational arcs where suffering led inevitably to triumphant vindication. They struggled to understand or convey the more difficult reality, that Dante had been complicit in his own invisibility, even while being victimized by it, that his choices had been both strategic and self-destructive, that he could be simultaneously wronged and responsible for the forms that wrong had taken. The attention felt invasive in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to perform a version of himself that aligned with public expectations of what a wronged genius should look like. He gave interviews where he heard his own words being translated into sound bites that captured the drama while missing the nuance, saw his face in articles accompanied by captions that reduced 17 years of complex compromise into single sentences about unrecognized brilliance. The plant itself became a stranger place for Dante as the lawsuit progressed through its slow legal machinery. Some co-workers treated him with new respect, approaching him as if proximity to his story might somehow elevate their own. Others maintained careful distance, either uncomfortable with the conflict or aligned with management's perspective that Dante was being ungrateful for opportunities he had been given. The production line he had repaired continued its smooth operation, generating profits that would eventually be entered as evidence in his legal case, physical proof that his innovations had value even if the company had refused to acknowledge his authorship. He still came to work each day, though his role had become increasingly ambiguous, technically still employed, but practically set apart, doing maintenance work that felt performative, now that everyone knew what he was capable of, beyond basic repairs. The factory floor that had been his refuge for 17 years transformed into a stage where his every action was observed and interpreted according to whatever narrative the observer found most comfortable. Patricia Chen warned him repeatedly that legal vindication was neither guaranteed nor necessarily healing, that even if they won the case, the process itself would exact costs that might not be worth whatever compensation or recognition resulted. Court dates stretched across months, each appearance requiring Dante to relive his choices and have them dissected by lawyers, whose job was to make him seem either heroic or pathetic, depending on which side had hired them. He sat in depositions where his memory of 20-year-old conversations was treated as unreliable, while corporate records were presented as objective truth, where his years of silence were used as evidence both for and against his current claims. The emotional toll accumulated like interest on a debt he hadn't known he was carrying. Sleepless nights, the constant low-grade anxiety of having his character and competence questioned publicly, the exhausting performance of confidence required to maintain his case, when doubt kept whispering that he should have just accepted the board's initial offer and spared himself this prolonged exposure. The settlement, when it finally came 14 months after Dante had rejected the original offer, was neither the triumphant vindication nor the complete defeat that the extremes of possibility had suggested. The company agreed to a financial compensation package substantially larger than their initial proposal, but still far less than the actual value his patents had generated over 2 decades. They issued a statement acknowledging his contributions to the foundational technology, but carefully worded to avoid admission of intentional exploitation. Most significantly from Patricia Chen's strategic perspective, they agreed to make his patents part of the public record with full attribution to Dante Gray as the original inventor, ensuring that anyone researching the technology would encounter his name and story. The terms included no non-disclosure agreement. Dante was free to speak about his experience, free to tell his story without the silencing clauses that had been central to the board's original offer. The settlement was, Patricia explained, a pragmatic compromise that gave him something of what he wanted, while allowing the company to avoid the greater embarrassment of a full trial. Dante Gray signed the settlement documents in Patricia Chen's office on a gray afternoon in Chicago, his signature marking the end of a legal battle, but not the resolution of the deeper questions that had driven him to fight in the first place. The money would change his material circumstances significantly, would allow him to leave the plant if he chose or negotiate better terms if he stayed. The public acknowledgement of his patents meant his name would now appear in technical databases and industrial histories, a small correction to the record that felt both essential and insufficient. But what he had truly gained or lost through this entire process remained unclear even to himself. The visibility he now had came with exposure he hadn't fully anticipated. The vindication felt hollow in ways that suggested something more fundamental than legal recognition had been at stake all along. Walking out of Patricia's office into the Chicago afternoon, Dante felt neither the triumph of victory nor the despair of defeat, but rather a kind of exhausted relief, the feeling of someone who has finally put down a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. The question that haunted Dante in the months that followed was whether the recognition had been worth the cost of pursuing it, whether the years of peace he had sacrificed to fight for acknowledgement had been a fair trade for the partial vindication he had achieved. He found himself returning to this question during sleepless nights, turning it over like a puzzle with missing pieces, trying to calculate an equation where all the variables kept changing value. The truth, he gradually came to understand, was that there had never been a right answer, only different versions of loss. The loss of remaining silent and invisible versus the loss of peace and privacy that came with speaking. His silence had cost him dignity and self-respect. His speech had cost him the comfortable anonymity he had used as protection from a world that had proven indifferent to his worth. Both choices exacted their price, and the only certainty was that there existed no version of his story where he emerged unscathed from the fundamental injustice of having his brilliance stolen and then being blamed for not fighting harder to get it back. Dante eventually left the manufacturing plant, using his settlement to fund a small, independent consulting practice, where he helped other inventors navigate the systems that had nearly destroyed him. He worked with young people who reminded him of his 26-year-old self, people full of brilliant ideas and dangerous optimism, teaching them the practical realities that no one had taught him about protecting intellectual property and advocating for their own worth. His story circulated in engineering schools and startup incubators as both inspiration and warning, proof that hidden genius could be vindicated, but also evidence of the high cost that vindication might require. The plant continued operating with machinery built on his designs, now carrying small plaques acknowledging his authorship, a gesture of recognition that felt simultaneously meaningful and inadequate. And on quiet evenings in his Chicago apartment, Dante Gray would sometimes take out the old notebooks from his 20s and read the sketches and calculations of the young man who had believed the world would recognize brilliance automatically, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and gratitude for that naive hope that had eventually led him through 2 decades of silence to the hard-won understanding that sometimes the only peace available is the peace that comes from finally refusing to hide.